The camera holds on a vintage magazine cover where a movie star stands mid-smile. His tuxedo is pressed perfectly, and his eyes catch the light just right. You see a sold-out premiere and hear the roar of a standing ovation, which is exactly the image the industry wanted you to see. Now you have to ask the other question. What did it actually cost to keep that image intact? Hollywood has always mastered the art of manufacturing a story, but the darker reality is what the studios paid to bury one. This was not about a single payment, one lone fixer, or a moment of silence purchased in a back office. The $100 million mask represents a cumulative architecture of legal and financial power built across 7 decades to protect powerful men from the consequences of their own behavior. We are looking at 3 men, 3 distinct eras, and one single system, right up until the moment that system finally broke. The studio system didn't just manufacture stars, it manufactured silence. And the price tag for that silence would eventually reach 9 figures. To understand what the system eventually became, you first need to understand the foundation it was built on. The Golden Age studio system was not just a creative enterprise that happened to have a legal department. The reality was that it functioned as a control apparatus with a filmmaking division attached to it. Studios owned their talent outright through 7-year contracts and option clauses that gave them the right to dictate who you married, how much you weighed, and what the public was allowed to know about your life. Morality clauses provided the legal spine for this level of control. Universal Studios introduced the first one in 1921 after the career of comedian Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle collapsed following a massive scandal. The language in that clause was incredibly direct, stating that any conduct bringing public hatred, contempt, or ridicule was a fireable offense. Other studios adopted the practice immediately, and within a single year, it became the industry standard. What the morality clause actually created was something far more useful than a simple way to fire people. It created a massive incentive for suppression. If a studio had the power to fire a star for scandalous conduct, they had every financial reason to ensure that conduct never reached the light of day. This clause did not just punish a scandal, but instead, it funded the entire infrastructure required to prevent one. Rock Hudson serves as the clearest case study for how that infrastructure operated under the surface. Universal's investment in the image of Hudson as a matinee idol and the most eligible bachelor in Hollywood required the active suppression of his homosexuality. This was not a case of passive ignorance, but rather a system of coordinated fabrication. Studios employed private investigators and regularly traded sensitive information with tabloids to keep stories buried. When the magazine Confidential threatened to expose Hudson in the mid-1950s, the fix at Universal began to negotiate. They offered up a different target by giving the magazine information on fellow actor Tab Hunter. This was reputation management treated as a zero-sum transaction where one scandal was disclosed, so another could be protected. Because Hudson's box office value justified every dollar spent on that infrastructure, the studios viewed him as a high-value asset. The mask they created was not a favor to the actor, but a calculated investment in their own bottom line. That financial logic of protecting the asset and bearing the cost formed the original architecture of the industry. When the studio system collapsed in the late 1940s under federal antitrust pressure, the studios lost their monopoly on distribution. But they never lost that logic. The infrastructure did not disappear, it simply privatized. If you want to understand how that shift happened in practice, join us by subscribing to When Hollywood Turned. We track these kinds of systemic evolutions and look at the history the industry prefers you don't follow. Bill Cosby represents what happens when the machinery of suppression successfully crosses between different eras of Hollywood. According to dozens of women who eventually came forward, his pattern of misconduct began in the 1960s within the informal networks of the old studio system. This behavior continued through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s. And with every passing decade, the tools used to silence his accusers became more sophisticated. Cosby simply adapted as the industry changed around him. The public had no way of knowing that Cosby had already made a direct admission in a 2005 deposition, and the legal system worked exactly as intended to keep that secret. During those proceedings, he acknowledged that he obtained quaaludes specifically to give to women he wanted to have sex with. Even though this document was a product of the legal discovery process, the same infrastructure designed to protect his interests kept it buried for an entire decade. The logic behind this silence was a matter of simple arithmetic, because a civil settlement was always cheaper than public exposure. Cosby used his America's Dad persona, defined by the sweaters, the family-friendly sitcom, and his lectures on personal responsibility, as a highly effective reputational shield. Allegations would surface from time to time, but they were neutralized before they could gain any real traction. Networks, studios, and PR firms all held a massive financial stake in the Cosby brand. And when so many institutions have that much money tied to one person, they naturally become part of the suppression architecture. They didn't always have to act illegally or even knowingly to help keep the mask in place. They just had to follow the money. The deposition that eventually brought the whole system down had been sitting in a file the entire time. The mask didn't fall away because the truth finally emerged, but rather because the financial calculation reached its expiration date. By 2014, Cosby's commercial value had faded and the math had changed, which allowed a single comedian in a stand-up set to say out loud what had been documented for years. Before Weinstein ever hired a single intelligence operative, he studied exactly how Cosby's machine had worked for 50 years. And then he made it corporate. Harvey Weinstein watched how this played out very closely, and he decided to build a system that ensured the math would never fail him. While the era of Rock Hudson relied on fixers and Bill Cosby used settlements, Harvey Weinstein transformed suppression into something that looked like a modern corporation. He created a vertically integrated enterprise that used legal teams, private intelligence firms, and ironclad contracts to enforce silence across multiple countries at the same time. To understand how this worked, you have to look at the language in his contracts. Weinstein's employment agreements from 2005 and 2010 actually included a cure period that allowed him to keep his job as long as he repaid the company for any misconduct settlements. This means the contract didn't actually prohibit his behavior, but instead, it created a budget for it. Misconduct was treated as a recoverable business expense, which shows that the mask had moved from the shadows of the studio backlot directly into the accounting department. Weinstein eventually took things a step further by hiring Black Cube, a private intelligence firm staffed by former officers from Israel's Mossad. These operatives used fake identities to track and intimidate women who were considering speaking to the press, and their goal was never to find the truth. They were running a funded operation with specific deliverables and invoices designed to stop stories before they could ever be published. The final piece of this architecture was the non-disclosure agreement, or the NDA. Back in the old studio days, a morality clause gave a studio the power to fire an actor for damaging their reputation. But Weinstein's NDAs flipped that power dynamic completely. These agreements didn't restrict the person committing the act. They were designed to bind the victims. Out of the more than 100 women who accused Weinstein, at least 8 signed settlements with these clauses, and one 1998 agreement reportedly tried to stop the signer from even testifying in a criminal trial. When you add up the cost of the settlements, the legal fees, the intelligence contracts, and the PR retainers, you find the real meaning behind the title of this video. The $100 million mask isn't just a metaphor for Hollywood secrets, but a literal line item in a ledger. However, even a system this expensive had a structural weakness that Weinstein couldn't fix. His power in the industry had already started to slip before the major exposés broke in late 2017, and his recent films were no longer making the money they used to. The financial logic that kept the mask in place, the idea that silence is cheaper than exposure, inverted the moment he stopped being a profitable asset. The system didn't fall apart because the legal protections stopped working, but because the return on the investment was no longer there. The contracts that were supposed to protect victims didn't just fail. In some cases, they were specifically written to protect the abuser's budget line instead. If you look back at Hudson and Cosby, you can see how the underlying logic remained the same for 70 years. Private investigators eventually became high-end intelligence firms, and phone calls from studio fixers turned into cure period clauses in corporate contracts. The goal was always to protect the asset and bury the liability at any cost. The mask was always an investment, and in Hollywood, investments are abandoned the second they stop paying off. The legal landscape eventually shifted as the Speak Out Act began restricting non-disclosure agreements in cases of sexual misconduct. And these reforms gained further ground when California placed new limits on how NDAs could be enforced. Beyond the courtroom, the Screen Actors Guild updated its internal codes, while the industry adopted mandatory intimacy coordinators to protect performers on set. These changes forced the studio system to finally show its seams, yet the underlying incentive to hide the truth never truly disappeared. The reality is that, as long as a single human being represents a 9-figure valuation on a corporate balance sheet, the financial logic of the mask will simply find new ways to adapt. While the specific tools of suppression might change, the cold arithmetic of the business remains exactly the same. The industry didn't fund these secrets because of some inherent evil, but rather because protecting the image was profitable, and that fundamental calculation has never been repealed. If this investigation raised questions you hadn't considered before, subscribe to When Hollywood Turned and share this video with someone who still believes the glamour of the silver screen was free.